So all over the world, we have reported sightings of hairy hominids, beasts, throwbacks to a prehistoric age, maybe. In the Himalayan mountains, though, is a truly sort of unique hairy hominid. It has its own characteristics. Yeah, the locals call the Meto Kangmi. In America, we call it the Yeti, or abominable snowman. And I'm going to tell you where that name comes from.
Please stay tuned.
From a child born into this world, we are taught what to believe. Closed-minded we become, fearful to be deceived. Still we desire to know what lies beyond that locked door. The art of the storyteller, conjuring tales of legend and lore. History hidden, lost knowledge, things forgotten and the unknown. These are the things that direct us and will set the tone. Welcome, friends, to another episode of Nightmares on the Lost Highway.
So the Yeti is one of the many hairy hominids known to roam the world. I think in America we have Sasquatch sightings in every state except Hawaii, which, of course, Hawaii wasn't part of the original Pangea, whatever you want to call it, that original continent. It's a volcanic island, so Yeti or Bigfoots would probably have to migrate there.
I think it would be strange to see a Sasquatch Bigfoot in Hawaii.
We're going to start with a description of the Yeti here, and then we can go into some sightings and the origins of the abominable snowman moniker. So the Yeti is said to be very muscular, covered in dark gray to reddish brown hair. They weigh between 200 to 400 pounds on average, and they're short compared to American Bigfoot. They average about 6 feet tall.
Oh, an average-sized human as far as height.
Yeah. They have a pointy, crowned, conical head, which seems to be pretty common in the artwork, with a wide mouth full of large teeth. They have very long arms. They're commonly regarded as being peaceful. Now, this is the most common description of the Yeti, the one that pops up the most in folklore and in the sightings of travelers in the mountains. They inhabit the Himalayas, and that's where they're seen. Now, those are the most common descriptions. However, there seem to be 3 varieties of Yeti that are commonly reported by the locals. We have first what we call the Little Yeti. It is said to be just 3 to maybe 4.5 feet in height. They inhabit warmer climates than the other Yetis and are usually found in the forested valleys below the snow line in Nepal, Bhutan, Tibet, and Sikkim. Theories, of course, say that this is possibly a juvenile or even a female Yeti proper.
That's what I was wondering, if the size might not dictate the age or the sex.
Then we have what you call the Big Yeti. It kind of lives up to the common description that I gave earlier, 6 foot tall, reddish brown hair, muscular. It is known to attack yaks at times, and they are reported to live from 13 to 15,000 feet above sea level. So they're up in the mountains.
Gotcha.
And then you have what we call the Nialmo. This is a true giant, said to be 13 to 20 feet tall.
Wow.
He feeds on yaks, mountain sheep, and possibly even people. Now, he is said to wander the eternal snows of the altitudes above 13,000 feet. Now, Bernard Heuvelmans, sort of a renowned cryptozoologist and was very involved in the Yeti phenomenon, he suggested that Nialmo may be a myth inspired by the idea that Yetis get larger the higher up in the mountains you climb.
Higher altitude, taller, larger?
Well, Well, again, let's go back to D&D. You go up in the mountains, you get mountain giants, and hill giants are a little shorter, mountain giants a little bigger.
We even talked about the oxygen difference up in that area. Obviously, if that's what you grew into, then you're going to react differently to it. Your body will.
Now, of course, scientifically speaking, the less oxygen you have, the smaller you're going to be. So that kind of
little contradictory,
counterproductive. So, of course, like we said earlier, the Yeti comes from Himalayan folklore.
Now, I've got a couple other stories. If you don't mind, I'll kind of jump in. Now, you had mentioned, of course, that these sightings are all over the area. I've got one, actually. There's a creature called a chuchana. It is of Russian folklore in the Siberian Arctic area. It's described as 6 to 8 feet tall, so kind of your medium, or I think what you called the large.
Yeah, the Russians had like a full-scale expedition to find that, I believe.
But again, what was interesting here, we got Himalayans, we got, the white snow, but all of them describe the Chuchana as dark hair, which is very much like Bigfoot Sasquatch type.
Well, a typical Yeti sightings, dark gray to reddish brown.
Their hair color
They're not
does
usually
change.
found. I know the pop culture sort of depicts the abominable snowman as being white, but that's not usually
necessarily true. Now, again, they say in the Russian version of the Chuchana that it is a Neanderthal type man wearing pelts. And while it has white patches for some reason that it has on its forearm. So their portrayal of this particular creature is it's not a monster. It's a Neanderthal man dressed in furs.
Now, you saying that, I know we're probably going to get a little bouncy here. I do remember there's a bit of Russian folklore about a woman who supposedly had a child, I believe, with one of these creatures because they're genetically similar.
Okay, makes sense. Well, this thing, it's said to occasionally consume human flesh. The hunter becomes the hunted, so to speak. So obviously, unlike many of their cousins, the vegetarians, vegetables on the side, please, but definitely a man flesh eater. And again, the belief isn't that it's a monster, but literally it's ancient man that somehow has survived in Siberia, of all places. So I thought that was interesting, semi-related.
We talked about Siberia before. That's a unforgiving, harsh land.
Yeah, that's where it's almost a place, Siberia is where they send people to be forgotten, basically, and they just may not come back. So, yeah, definitely. Now, also, pre-19th century, Buddhists had some beliefs, and several of the groups there in the Himalayan mountains stated that they worshipped what they called a glacial being.
The god of the hunt.
The god of the hunt. That's quite a title. Other folklore recalled a red-eyed primitive man, ape creature, who was said to have carried a large stone that had been constructed into a weapon. And he swings it around, kind of making a swooshing noise to kind of taunt the people or creatures that he's hunting.
I'm probably going to mess up the name on that one. I have it here too. The Miragod.
We're going to go with your pronunciation on that.
Or Wild Man.
You got but let's go Wild Man.
Yeah, they believe that the blood of the Wild Man was mystical, and it figured into some of their ceremonies.
Interesting.
You want to go, early. Alexander the Great demanded that he be presented with a Yeti when he conquered the Indus Valley in 326 BC.
Well, that seems a reasonable request.
Well, the locals told him that wasn't possible, that Yetis could not survive at low altitudes. So they refused his request. Now, I did say I was going to tackle the origin of the abominable snowman name, so I kind of want to dig into that a little bit. I think it's an interesting story. Here in Western pop culture, we call it the abominable snowman. The Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer special has the abominable.
Love that.
So we use that name. Now, that name was coined in 1921. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Howard Bury led the 1921 British Mount Everest reconnaissance expedition. He wrote a book talking about his adventures, and in the book, he included an account of crossing the Lac Padala, which is northeast of Mount Everest. And there he found footprints that he believed were, and I quote, probably caused by a large loping gray wolf, which in the soft snow formed double tracks rather like those of a barefooted man.
I remember reading about this.
Now, his Sherpa guides at once volunteered, and again I quote, that the tracks must be that of the wild man of the snows, to which they gave the name Meto Kangmi. So that's a hyphenated Meto-Kangmi. Meto translates to man-bear, and Kangmi translates as snowman. Now, Henry Newman, a contributor to the Statesman in Calcutta, which I believe is a newspaper, he interviewed the men of that expedition, and he translated Meto as filthy for some reason. And then he punched it up a little bit and called it abominable. So then it became abominable snowman.
It does sound better than filthy snowman.
Well, yeah, but I mean, man-bear snowman?
Man-bear snowman.
But that is the origin of the name abominable snowman that we
interesting.
use here in the West.
That is. And to me, as soon as you say the abominable snowman, I think of the Santa Christmas special, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. That's what I am picturing in my mind.
That's when you picture the big hairy white hairy beast.
Yeah, kind of
Which-
bluish skin.
None of the Yeti sightings
Yeah.
have white
Yeah.
fur.
Not so
Or
much.
I'm sure there may be some, but mostly they're that gray to red.
I had a similar story. This was in 1925. There was a photographer and members of the Royal Geographical Society, and they recorded that they saw a creature. It was about 15,000 feet near Zimu Glacier that you, I think, had mentioned. Seems to be kind of a reoccurring hotspot. He had observed this creature for about a minute to a minute and a half, and he guessed it was 250, 300 yards away. He said this creature showed up very well because it was a contrast of the dark fur against the white snow. He said it was definitely a human shape, in his words, quote unquote, walked upright, and it seemed to stop occasionally to pull at some bushes. There were some rhododendrons, I think, that grew in the area, as if possibly it was stopping to eat as it was foraging. Now, he said as far as he could tell, again, 250 to 300 yards away, he didn't see any forms of clothing, and he did not feel that it was a human wearing a coat or anything because the entire body was covered.
Now, I'm not a mountain climber, but 15,000 feet by a glacier seems like a good place to have clothes.
I think it would stand without reason that a gal, I don't care how tough you are, you're probably not going to survive for too awfully long out there if you have no clothes on. He went and alerted somebody in his group. There were multiple people that saw this, so it wasn't just a single. And the group, I don't know if they were kind of already heading that direction, but regardless, they made a decision to go inspect that area. It took them about 2 hours to cross that distance. However, that they did find the creature's prints. They said it was similar to the shape of a man, but only 6 to 7 inches.
Yeah, they were small.
Small. So a small foot, if anything. But anyhow, they wanted to confirm, and again, they got over there. They saw the small prints, about 4 inches wide, 6 to 7 inches long. And the creature's prints they thought was undoubtedly bipedal, obviously an animal using only 2 legs for walking, but there was no signs of it.
Yeah, a lot of sightings are kind of like that. They're not prolonged sightings. They're just little blurbs. I think kind of like when we talked about, shadow people. And that's strange for a phenomenon that's been around for so long.
Yes.
Because, I have in 1932, in James Princep's Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, he published the account of an explorer named B.H. Hodgson, in which local guides had spotted a tall bipedal creature covered in long dark hair, which fled from them. Now, they, of course, were superstitious, and they concluded it was the wild man of the mountains. Hodgson himself concluded that it must be a lost orangutan. Which,
Heard several references to orangutan, apes.
I'm sure you've been to the zoo and you've seen an orangutan.
Mm-hmm.
You know their shape. They're not 6 feet tall, usually.
No.
And they definitely have their own kind of way of getting around. That's
I was going to say, I wouldn't call it a bipedal standing erect walking with 2 legs.
Yeah, they don't look like people when they walk around. So one of the earlier sightings, 1899, Lawrence Waddell, in the book Among the Himalayas, recounted seeing footprints. His guides described a large ape-like creature had left these prints. He thought they had been made by a bear, and bears seem to be the most common way to dismiss Yeti sightings.
Now, is this the photograph that has the pickaxe that was laying next to it? It's kind of renowned as one of the best footprints.
It may be. I don't remember finding where that was.
I remember I kept coming across, it's a photo with a 3-toed footprint. Yeah. And they have a typical size ice pick sitting next to it for
sort of the
scale.
Most common Yeti photo.
I come across that over and over. Okay.
Waddell, of course, he had heard the stories of the ape-like creature, but he didn't believe that there had ever been an authentic sighting of it. He didn't think the Yeti was real. And then again, we just have kind of a slate of just little hit and misses here.
One of the things we talked about before we started recording, I think, is one of the more interesting stories, and I won't steal all of your thunder, but I do have a newspaper article dated March 19th, 1954, and it was simply called the Daily Mail. They printed an article which described an expedition of a couple teams actually obtaining hair specimens from what was alleged to be a Yeti scalp, and it was found at a monastery. The hairs were black to a dark brown in color, and if you had them in the sunlight, they said that they would actually reflect almost like a fox-like red tint. Very orangutan-ish, if you will. They were examined by Professor Frederick Wood Jones and an expert also in human and anatomy. During the study, the hairs were bleached for whatever reason. I guess this was part of the scientific steps at the time. It was then cut into sections.
Who doesn't want to see a bleach blonde Yeti?
A bleach blonde Yeti. These sections were then analyzed with a microscope, and then comparing those samples obtained with other known animals, such as bears and orangutans, both which we've mentioned. Now, Dr. Jones contended that the samples did not match a bear nor orangutan, but he believed they were more out of a goat or a cow.
Yeah, there's a lot of hair samples come up in my research, and I kind of just steered away from them because, to be honest, for the most part, they're not very convincing.
No.
There's one a separate incident where they had tested, some alleged Yeti hair, and if I remember the details correctly, they found that they were more similar to a bear, but not of an existing bear, of a bear that has supposedly been extinct. Some sort of glacial polar bear that they have in the fossil record that doesn't, it's supposed to have been extinct
that's
for
interesting enough.
Thousands of years. Yeah, that in itself would be fascinating if we had these glacial polar bears.
Now, with all the interest, like you said, you take what you want, what you believe, but Nepal really started stepping up about 1957. Nepal stepped up and they said, look, any expeditions continuing on regarding the Yeti or the wild man, 3 rules are going to be followed. The first one, obviously, you got to have a government permit. We want to know when you're investigating, and they also wanted to see first any evidence that was obtained. 2, don't harm the Yeti, unless it's for self-defense. That clause was put in there. And thirdly, as I started to say, the Nepal government wants to see it first, but they have to approve anything before it gets released to the public.
Well, and I believe those rules were agreed to by the United States government, too.
That is
if
correct.
I remember correctly.
Yes, I think you are.
Now,
so they obviously, I think, stood up, and maybe we don't know for sure what it was, but to defend it, to set rules in place.
But that last rule, I mean, we've heard rules like that before on other phenomenon where it's like we get to control what's coming out about it. So if somebody were to suddenly definitively debunk
it,
the Yeti,
they could also
let that out?
This is going to cut down part of our tourism. Yeah, we're not gonna allow that to slip out. But I did find that as interesting. Now, are you going to get into the story with James Stewart?
I just have a little blurb about it, so if you've got a little more detail than I do, I can at least summarize it. I find it to be one of my favorite Yeti stories. I've read it repeatedly, but it's the story of actor Jimmy Stewart.
Jimmy Stewart.
Which, let's regard him as a classic American actor.
Absolutely.
Sort of a good guy. While visiting in India, and I believe it was in Pongbochi, I think is how you say it.
I believe that is correct.
He allegedly smuggled a Yeti hand out of India. So that seemed like it'd be
a movie actor smuggling a Yeti hand out. I come across the story and I thought, I got to find out more about this. So I kind of dug into it a little bit more. Penboshi, I believe, is correct in the pronunciation. And in general history, this hand is considered the Penboshi hand.
And I believe it's something of like a holy relic almost, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, it was rumored and believed, obviously, to be from a Yeti. One finger bone of the hand was tested at one point, and DNA showed it to be human. So there's that first little morsel. Adding more confusion and mystery to the story, however, there was a Tom Slick. He was an oil businessman, an adventurer.
And let me just say, when it comes to searching for the unknown and the unexplained, I love the name Tom
Slick. It sounds like an old magazine title kind of thing.
Or maybe one of those old cartoons like, the Johnny Quest or something like that.
Yeah. Well, Tom Slick, he had led several expeditions himself in search of the Yeti, and he had said to have discovered this Penboshi hand at a monastery previously. Now, when the monks were asked, could it be removed to be scientifically studied, they absolutely said, no way, you are not touching this, because it had been passed down for at least decades in the monastery, and yes, it was kind of considered a holy kind of relic. Tom Slick and one of his associates might have stolen a few pieces of that original hand, as the story goes.
We're not going to let anything get in the way of the truth here.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the stuff, and you go down these rabbit holes, but some of the stuff said that on one of the expeditions where he had discovered this at a monastery, they had lost a man in the trip, froze to death or whatever. The rumors are that they removed his couple fingers to replace it with this Yeti hand. Now, you have to envision, this Yeti hand isn't like in a glass display box for everybody to see. It's wrapped up in linens and cotton. So, yeah, you could technically pull off a couple finger bones, I guess, and maybe slide some others in there and wrap it back up.
We appreciate your sacrifice, Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. You'll go down in history, not maybe in the way you wanted to. But so there was this, that these finger bones had been stolen for scientific study, and replaced it with that of a known human adventurer. So then you have to say, okay, well, at what point was it discovered that the finger was dictated by DNA to be human, and was it really that old? But the history of this Penboshi hand, the monks finally, they kept going back, and I'm sure they just harassed the heck out of these poor monks,
Yeah.
It's so rude. I mean, honestly, it is.
Well, it's American, though.
Yeah, it is. It's probably one of the most American things we do, but it's sad. But they stated that the origins of the Yeti hand were legitimate, it was real, and that many, many decades ago, one of their own had walked into a cave to meditate. And while they're in the cave, he found a Yeti that he was sharing the cave with. He did not harm it, and the Yeti did not harm him. So it was kind of a spiritual, accepting nature, one accepting another.
Again, the Yeti's commonly regarded as being peaceful, and I know, the religions in the area, they revere the Yeti. That's a spiritual entity to them.
Yes, that's why you don't want any harm to come to it. Well, finally, he completes his meditation. They share the cave together. He leaves the Yeti there. And I guess later on, it does mention that, there wasn't a lot of communication. There wasn't a lot of, up close. It was the Yeti was in the cave with me, but it was kind of off to the side. Now, several years later, the same monk returned to the same cave, and he found the Yeti deceased. So maybe the Yeti was sick when he was there years ago. Maybe that's where the Yeti lived, and it finally just died of old age. But he felt that story needed to be shared and proven. So that is where the hand come from. He actually, it said, removed a scalp, which I'd mentioned in one of the earlier stories, as well as this hand, and he took it back basically to bestow upon the monks of his monastery to protect this new religious artifact. After several people had studied it, again, which fingers did they study? At what time frame did it all take place? Scientifics said that it was the closest match they could find would have been a Neanderthal type man.
And that seems to come up quite a bit, the Neanderthal connection. Well, I've just got a series of little one-offs, and if you hear one that you have a little more detail on.
All right.
Like I said, it's just kind of a lot of little sightings. So I have in 1940, and I'm going to butcher this name, I'm sure, Slawomir Rewitz, documented in his book, The Long Walk, that his group had been stopped while crossing the Himalayas when their path was blocked for hours by two bipedal animals that just seemed to be shuffling around in the snow.
Two of them.
1942, documented in Myra Shackley's book, Still Living, Yeti, Sasquatch, and the Neanderthal Enigma. There's a Neanderthal
There's that reference again.
Two hikers saw two black specks moving across the snow about a quarter mile below them. And then, quote, the height was not much less than 8 feet. The heads were described as squarish, and the ears must lie close to the skull. Shoulders were sloped sharply down to a powerful chest, and it was covered in reddish-brown hair.
As you're saying this, I'm sorry, I'm picturing Harry and the Hendersons.
Well, that head shape is definitely
That Neanderthal big
but
forehead.
Harry would have
back.
been too big.
Much larger version.
1948. Peter Byrne reports finding Yeti footprints in northern Sikkim, India, near the Zimu Glacier, which we've mentioned before.
Hotspot.
1951. Eric Shipton takes photos of a number of prints in the snow at about 20,000 feet above sea level. And that's where your big Yetis are at. The big boy. But it doesn't document the size of the footprint. 1953. And here's a famous name, Sir Edmund Hillary. And Tenzing Norgay reported seeing footprints while scaling Mount Everest. Tenzing believed that the Yeti was just a large ape. He had never seen one, but his father had seen one twice. He was a native of the area. 1954, mountaineer John Jackson tracked and photographed many footprints in the snow.
Now, on your research, a lot of the research I did for the Yeti, it seemed to have only 3 or 4 toes. Is that?
I did not find reference to the toes. So.
I was kind of, when I went into this, a lot of people, I think, I had been, asked, well, what's the difference between a Yeti and a Bigfoot, And I, if nothing else, I think people should learn here that there are several differences. One, the Bigfoot, Sasquatch, if you will, to Northern America seems to be a human-shaped foot, but just on a larger scale, for the most part. This, however, does seem to have a totally different footprint, if you want
to throw back, though, when we talked about the Falk monster, I think we talked about
it. Did mention it,
toes.
And one toe kind of pulled off to the side. But a lot of this reference, it seems to always, or not always, but a majority of the time go back to that Neanderthal man aspect.
Yeah, that comes up quite a bit.
I think that, if nothing else, should definitely differentiate the two.
Got a couple more. 1970, mountaineer Don Willens claimed to have seen a Yeti when scaling Annapurna, and says at one point in time he saw it moving on all fours. And then finally, the last little documented sighting that I'm going to put in this group, March of 86, Anthony Wooldridge, a hiker in the Himalayas, saw what he thought was a Yeti. He said it was standing in the snow near a ridge about 500 feet away. Said it didn't move or make any noise, but he did see in the snow strange tracks that led in the direction of the creature. And this is just a smattering of all Yeti sightings. And there's many, many more, obviously. I know shows like what's the Josh Gates Expedition
Unknown.
I think I even watched that particular episode.
I remember that one.
I mean, I hate to be this guy, but with most of those shows, they got as close as you can possibly get to seeing the thing without actually seeing it. So now, something that did stand out I thought was kind of interesting and kind of revitalized interest in the Yeti phenomenon. In April of 2019, the Indian Army had a mountaineering expedition team. And they actually posted on, I think they had Twitter, maybe?
Right.
Instagram, something like that.
Something along those lines.
Social media. They posted where they had found Yeti footprints in the mountains up in the snow. And this, again, when we talk about documenting unexplained phenomenon, this is the Indian Army.
Yeah.
Like they're
in 2019. I mean, pretty
and they're
darn
documenting these Yeti footprints and claiming them to be Yeti footprints.
Now, one of the things in the research, did you come across anything with any like skeletal remains, with the exception of the one hand and the scalp?
Again, I kind of shied away from a lot of the physical remains because it seemed like a lot of those stories always ended with, they were very inconclusive.
Yeah, he said, she said.
So no, I don't remember finding anything.
I didn't
like
come
that.
across that either, which again, that is something in maybe conjunction with local Bigfoot Sasquatch. That's one of the things that scientists are like, okay, well, if they've been there for this long, show me skeletal remains, show me proof. But back to the only piece that I came across was this hand. I guess finally enough attention had come to that hand that they did return whatever was left to the monastery, which you think, oh, that's a nice gesture. But once again, America strikes. They came out on Unsolved Mysteries, an older show from the 80s. Many of you might remember.
Love that.
Oh, I did. That intro music especially. Anyhow, Unsolved Mysteries had done a special on it. And within months after airing, someone stole again the hand, and it went supposedly deep under the illegal underground of, black market antiquities. several people had bragged that they had it in their possession, even had some photos of it that looked very recent. But to this day, we may never know or see it ever again.
And that's a shame. These people revere that as a holy relic. And, again, here we are stealing it from them.
Yeah.
Which, if I was any good at impressions, I'd love to do a Jimmy Stewart impression of, like, I got your Yeti hand. But that's just a shame, Well, why
some
we have
millionaire or
to do
billionaires got it locked away in their basement with a
somebody
spotlight
with
on
more
it.
money than they got common sense, the kind of person that buys, I'm not going to imply anyone in particular, but the kind of person that would buy castles and T-Rex skulls. Okay, we're talking about Nicolas Cage.
Yes.
But people who have money and apparently no sense of respect for other people.
Yeah.
This is your holy relic, but since I got money, I'm going to...
Well, and especially when samples were taken from that, they did derive that it was a human DNA. Later samples was tying it back at that time for the technology, Neanderthal. I mean, that sounds like a key piece of information that as we learn more and more and advance in science, that we could probably learn a lot off of that lost piece.
If it's legit.
Legit.
There's a lot there to be learned, yeah.
It's sad.
So, and unfortunately, now we may never know.
Unless Nicolas Cage has it, and he'd like to come forward.
Well, I was going to say, if it ever does pop up again, how are you going to know if that's the legit, artifact?
Right. Well, it's got Bob's fingers in it, so we could track it back to that.
If one of the fingers doesn't match.
Well, we hope that you enjoyed this. It was educational and kind of fun to do on this. And again, it's just another example of what you might find on Nightmares on the Lost Highway. Thanks for listening in, folks. Hey, this is Eric, and I just wanted to give a little reach out and a plug to our first paying sponsor for Nightmares on the Lost Highway. That's our little family toy and gaming shop here in Lebanon, Missouri called Raven's Loft. If you happen to be in the central Missouri area, please check us out. We have 2 locations. First one is at 223 West Commercial, downtown Lebanon. We've also branched out to a second location out at the Heartland Antique Mall, also here in Lebanon. You're going to find all kinds of vintage toys, Star Wars, Star Trek, G.I. Joe, Transformers, Mego, Universal Monsters, all types of gaming, board games, Magic the Gathering. So we would appreciate it if you'd stop by. You can like our Facebook page. Swing by and check us out. Thank you so much. I would like to thank Alex Tudor, who has been helping us a lot with our endeavors on this podcast.
You could call him our producer at this point, I think.
Our producer, electronic recording technician. He's the one that's setting up all the mics and the hardware in the background. And then Bill Weirs is going through, taking his time to try to clean and edit this up and give us the best possible version that we can present to you folks. Want to thank everybody involved with that.